Life has a way of unraveling at the most unexpected moments. I was hosting our annual family Thanksgiving dinner, surrounded by loved ones, when my husband's phone rang. None of us could have predicted how that single call would expose years of deception and change our lives forever. But looking back, that evening wasn't just about discovering his betrayal. It was about how I turned his mistress's ultimatum into my own masterpiece of justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The warm aroma of roasted turkey and apple pie filled our Victorian home's dining room as I adjusted the crystal centerpiece on our mahogany table. November in Boston always felt magical, but this Thanksgiving promised to be extra special. My husband, Gregory, a prominent neurosurgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital, had finally managed to get the entire holiday off for the first time in 15 years of marriage. Our children, James, 14, and Sophie, 12, were actually dressed up without complaint, excited that their father would be present for the whole celebration. My in-laws, Richard and Eleanor Mitchell, had flown in from Seattle, and my sister Kate had driven up from New York with her husband David. Everything was perfect, down to the vintage Bordeaux breathing in the crystal decanter, Gregory's favorite. I'd spent weeks planning this dinner, determined to create the kind of Norman Rockwell moment we'd never quite managed to achieve with Gregory's demanding schedule. As chief of neurosurgery, he was always on call, always needed for one emergency or another. But not tonight. Tonight was about family. "Diana, the table looks stunning," Eleanor praised, placing her hand on my shoulder. My mother-in-law had always been my biggest supporter, teaching me all the family recipes when Gregory and I first married. "Gregory's favorite cornbread stuffing?" "Of course," I smiled, adjusting my name card. "And your secret cranberry sauce recipe." The doorbell chimed, and James rushed to answer it. "Aunt Maria's here," he called out. My younger sister entered, bringing a gust of cold air and her signature enthusiasm. As a successful art gallery owner in Boston's South End, Maria had an eye for beauty that showed in everything she did, including the elegant bottle of champagne she was carrying, for I. "Later," she winked, hugging me tight. "When we're celebrating having the mighty surgeon actually sit through an entire meal." Gregory emerged from his study, impeccable in his charcoal sweater and tailored slacks. Even after 15 years, he still took my breath away. Distinguished gray at his temples, strong jaw, and those intense green eyes that had captured my attention at that medical fundraiser where we'd first met. He was checking his phone, always checking his phone, but slipped it into his pocket when he saw his mother. "Mom? Dad? You're looking well." He embraced them both. "Seattle agrees. With retirement? Better than these Boston winters," Richard chuckled, but his eyes were sharp behind his glasses. My father-in-law, a retired judge, had always been observant. Perhaps that's why I caught him studying Gregory with an unreadable expression. The kitchen timer chimed, and I excused myself to check on the turkey. Maria followed me, reaching for wine glasses. "Need help, sis?" "Everything's under control," I assured her, opening the oven to baste the perfectly golden bird. "I just want tonight to be special." "Because Gregory's actually here?" Maria's tone was carefully neutral, but I knew what she wasn't saying. She'd been increasingly concerned about Gregory's long hours, his missed family events, the way he seemed more distant lately. But I'd defended him. His work was important, he was saving lives, and tonight would prove that family still came first. The dining room filled with conversation and laughter as everyone took their seats. Gregory sat at the head of the table, with me to his right and James to his left. Sophie sat beside her brother, already deep in conversation with her Aunt Kate about her latest school play. The turkey was carved, wine was poured, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Before we eat, Gregory stood, raising his glass. "I want to thank my beautiful wife for bringing us all together. Diana, You've always been the heart of this family, and I. His phone rang. The sound cut through the warm atmosphere like a knife. Gregory's face changed, just for a second, before he reached for his pocket. Sorry, I should check if it's the hospital. Gregory, Eleanor started, but he was already looking at the screen. What happened next seems almost surreal in my memory. Gregory's face drained of color. He excused himself, stepping into the hallway, but not before I caught a glimpse of the caller ID, Victoria P. The conversation at the table continued, but I felt a shift in the air. Richard was watching the doorway where his son had disappeared, his expression darkening. Maria caught my eye, raising an eyebrow in silent question. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Should we start? Sophie asked, eyeing the cooling food. We'll wait for your father, I said firmly, but something cold was settling in my stomach. Through the dining room's stained glass windows, I could see the sun setting, casting long shadows across our perfectly set table. Finally, Gregory returned. His face was composed, but I'd been married to him long enough to recognize the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands as he picked up his wine glass. Everything okay, Dad? James asked. Just a consultation, Gregory replied smoothly. Too smoothly. Where were we? We began passing dishes, but the easy atmosphere had evaporated. I watched as Gregory pushed food around his plate, checking his phone under the table every few minutes. Eleanor tried to engage him about the hospital's new neurology wing, but his responses were distracted. Then his phone buzzed again, a text this time. Gregory read it, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear in his eyes. Diana. His voice was strained. Could you join me in the kitchen for a moment? The voices at the table hushed. Maria's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently, before I stood. Gregory was already walking toward the kitchen, his shoulders rigid. I followed him, aware of every step on our hardwood floors, every tick of the antique clock in the hallway. In the kitchen, Gregory stood with his back to me, gripping the granite countertop so hard his knuckles were white. We need to talk, he said, not turning around. About Victoria? The name felt foreign on my tongue. He spun to face me, surprise, flickering across his features before he masked it. How did you... Caller ID, I said simply. Who is she, Gregory? The silence stretched between us, filled only by the muffled sounds of conversation from the dining room and the gentle hum of our refrigerator. Through the kitchen window I could see our garden, where Sophie's wind chimes danced in the November breeze. It's complicated, he finally said, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. Uncomplicate it. He opened his mouth to respond, but his phone buzzed again. Without thinking, he glanced at it. I was close enough to read the message that flashed across the screen. They need to know. Tell her now, or I will. I'm done waiting. Gregory? My voice was steady, surprising even me. What exactly does Victoria need everyone to know? He looked at me then, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in months. She's moving in. The words hung in the air between us, absurd in their simplicity. Moving in, I repeated, certain I'd misheard. To our house. She's pregnant, Diana. 3 months along. He said it quickly like ripping off a bandage, but his eyes never left his phone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm. Through the doorway, I could see our family. At the table, James showing his grandfather something on his phone, Sophie laughing at one of Maria's jokes, Eleanor adding more cranberry sauce to her plate. Our perfect Thanksgiving tableau, about to shatter. How long? I asked, surprised by how calm I sounded. Diana, please. How? Long? He deflated, leaning against the counter. 2 years. She was a pharmaceutical rep. We met at a conference in Chicago. 2 years. 2 years of lies, of late-night emergencies, of missed family dinners and school plays and anniversary celebrations. 2 years while I'd defended him to Maria, to our children, to myself. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Victoria. "Time's up. I'm calling the house phone in 5 minutes. They all deserve to know." I looked at my husband. This man I'd loved for 15 years, the father of my children, the person I'd built my life around, and saw a stranger. But more than that, I saw a coward. "Well," I said, smoothing down my silk blouse, "we shouldn't keep everyone waiting, especially not Victoria." Gregory's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" I was already walking back to the dining room, my heels clicking on the hardwood floors. Behind me, I heard Gregory's hurried footsteps, his whispered pleas for me to wait, to let him explain, to handle this privately. But I'd had enough privacy, enough of secrets. The landline phone sat on its cradle in the corner of the dining room, next to my grandmother's antique secretary desk. As I took my seat at the table, I kept my eyes on that phone, counting down the minutes until Victoria would make good on her threat. "Everything okay?" Maria asked, her eyes sharp with concern. I picked up my wine glass, taking a long sip of the Bordeaux that Gregory had insisted on serving. "Oh, yes," I smiled, watching my husband sink into his chair, his face ashen. "Everything's about to become very clear." The phone began to ring. The antique telephone's ring echoed through our dining room like a death knell. 6 pairs of eyes darted between the phone and Gregory, who sat frozen in his chair, wineglass suspended halfway to his lips. I watched him debate whether to leap for the phone, to prevent what was coming. But he didn't move. He couldn't. Not with everyone watching. "I'll get it," Sophie offered cheerfully, starting to rise from her chair. "No," I said calmly, setting down my wine glass. "I think I should take this call. After all, Victoria's been so eager to speak with all of us." Gregory's glass clattered against the table, red wine sloshing dangerously close to Eleanor's cream-colored sleeve. Maria's eyes narrowed at my words, her gallery owner's instinct for drama kicking in. My father-in-law, Richard, leaned forward, his judicial demeanor sliding into place. I stood, smoothing my black cocktail dress, the one Gregory had bought me for our anniversary last year, though now I wondered if he'd been with her that day too. My heels clicked against the hardwood as I crossed to the phone, each step measured and deliberate. "Diana." Gregory's voice was strangled. "Please." I lifted the receiver on the 4th ring, pressing the speaker button. The whole family deserved to hear this. "Mitchell residence," I said pleasantly, as if this were any other Thanksgiving evening. "Is Gregory there?" The voice was young, confident, with an edge of impatience. "It's Victoria. But I'm sure you already knew that, Diana." The room went deadly quiet. Sophie's fork clattered against her plate, the sound sharp in the silence. James looked between his father and me, confusion clouding his young face. "Yes, Victoria. Gregory's here. In fact, we're all here, having Thanksgiving dinner. Would you like me to introduce you to everyone?" "Diana, don't—" Gregory started to rise, but one look from his father stopped him cold. "Perfect timing." Victoria's voice held a smile. "Since I'll be joining the family soon, I should meet everyone. Has Gregory told you all the happy news?" Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, clutching her pearls, a gesture I'd always found melodramatic until this moment. Kate reached for Sophie's, hand under the table, while David stared intently at his plate. "Which news would that be, Victoria?" I kept my voice steady. "That you've been sleeping with my husband for 2 years? Or that you're planning to move into my house?" The gasps around the table were almost orchestral in their variety. Maria muttered something that sounded like, "Son of a bitch," under her breath. James stood up so abruptly his chair toppled backward. "Dad?" His voice cracked on the word. "Or perhaps," I continued, watching Gregory's face crumble. "You'd like to announce that you're pregnant? 3 months along, I believe you said?" "You told her?" Victoria's voice lost some of its smugness. "That wasn't the plan, Gregory. You were supposed to wait." "He didn't tell me," I interrupted. "You did. With your perfectly timed call and your ultimatum. Very dramatic, by the way. I appreciate good theater." Through the speaker, we heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath. She hadn't expected this version of me. Calm, controlled, almost amused. She'd probably imagined tears, screaming, and a breakdown in front of my family. That's what Gregory would have told her to expect. Sweet, supportive Diana, who always put everyone else first. "Well," Victoria rallied, "since everything's out in the open, we can stop pretending. Gregory and I love each other. We're having a baby. And this charade of a marriage needs to end." "Charade?" Eleanor's voice shook with rage. "Young woman, do you have any idea—" "Mom, please." Gregory finally found his voice. "This isn't— I can explain everything." "Explain?" Richard's judicial tone could have frozen hell. "Please, son, explain how you've betrayed your wife, your children, your entire family. I'm fascinated to hear the justification," Sophie began, to cry quietly, turning her face into Kate's shoulder. James remained standing, his teenage frame vibrating with emotion. "How could you?" he spat at his father. "Mom's done everything for you. Everything." "James, honey," I said softly, "please sit down. Let's hear what Victoria has to say. After all, she's gone to such trouble to orchestrate this moment." "That's right," Victoria's voice hardened. "I'm tired of being the secret, of watching Gregory play happy families with you while building a real future with me. I'm moving in this weekend. I've already packed." A laugh escaped me, genuine, surprising even myself. "Moving in? Here? To my house?" "It's Gregory's house, too," Victoria snapped. "And he wants me there. Don't you, darling?" All eyes turned to Gregory, who looked like he might be sick on his mother's cranberry sauce. "Victoria, we discussed this. Not now, not like this." "Yes, Gregory," I cut in. "When exactly were you planning this? Which room would Victoria be taking? The guest room needs redecorating anyway, though I doubt the afternoon light would be good for morning sickness. Or were you thinking of giving her our master suite, the one where we've slept for 15 years? The cruel edge in my voice shocked even me. I'd never spoken to anyone like this, least of all in front of our children. But something had broken, loose inside me. Years of trust, of compromise, of putting everyone else's needs first, crumbling like sand. "Diana," Maria stood, moving to my side. "Maybe we should—" "No." I held up my hand. "Victoria clearly has more to say. Don't you, Victoria? More demands? More ultimatums?" Through the speaker, we heard papers rustling. "Actually, yes. I have documentation of all our time together, Gregory. Every trip, every gift, every promise you made. Diana should know what she's losing." "What I'm losing?" Another laugh bubbled up. "Victoria, sweetheart, I don't think you understand what's happening here." I turned to face my family, taking in their shocked faces, the half-eaten Thanksgiving dinner growing cold on my grandmother's china. James, looking so much like his father had at that age, but with a moral compass that clearly came from somewhere else. Sophie, her young face streaked with tears but her eyes fierce. Maria, my sister, already plotting revenge in her artistic soul. The Mitchells, their Seattle sophistication shattered by their son's betrayal. "You see, Victoria," I continued, "while you were busy planning your grand entrance, making demands about my home, my family, you forgot something crucial. You forgot to wonder why I seem so calm." Silence on the other end of the line. "Diana?" Gregory's voice held a note of fear I'd never heard before. What did you do? I smiled, reaching into the antique secretary desk beside the phone. I did what any curator would do when presented with suspicious provenance. I investigated. From the drawer, I pulled out a thick manila envelope. Would you like to know what I found, Victoria? While you were documenting your affair with my husband, you ever stop to check who else might be keeping records? What are you talking about? Victoria's confidence wavered. Janet from the hospital board sends her regards, I said pleasantly. She's been quite concerned about certain irregularities in the neurology department's funding, particularly those private research grants you help secure through your pharmaceutical connections. Gregory's face went from red to white so fast I thought he might faint. You talked to Janet? Oh, Janet was just the beginning, I continued, pulling papers from the envelope. The hospital board, the medical ethics committee, the state licensing board. They've all been very interested in the relationship between Boston's top neurosurgeon and the pharmaceutical rep, who's been pushing experimental treatments through without proper protocols. You can't prove anything. Victoria's voice shook. Really? I laid out documents on the table, watching Gregory's eyes widen as he recognized the official hospital letterhead. Your company's internal audit team might disagree. They're particularly interested in those offshore accounts where the consulting fees have been going. Richard stood slowly, his legal mind processing the implications. Gregory, tell me you didn't— He did, I confirmed. And Victoria helped him hide it. Though I doubt she mentioned that part when she was planning to move into my house. The phone line crackled with Victoria's rapid breathing. Gregory, do something. But Gregory couldn't move. He was staring at the papers, evidence of every shortcut, every ethical breach, every dollar he'd taken in exchange for pushing certain medications through trials too quickly. You'll destroy his career, Victoria tried one last time. The father of your children— No, I cut her off. You and Gregory did that yourselves. I'm just making sure everyone knows exactly what kind of people you both are. I pressed a button. On my phone, and right on cue, Maria's tablet chimed with an incoming email. That would be from the hospital board, I explained to the room. They're announcing an emergency review of all trials overseen by Dr. Mitchell in the past 2 years. Victoria's company is already distancing themselves, claiming they had no knowledge of the ethical breaches. When? Gregory whispered. How long have you known? About the affair? 3 months? About the fraud? 2 months. I met his eyes across the table. Amazing what people will tell you when you start asking the right questions. Your secretary, Linda, was particularly helpful. She never did like how you made her falsify trial data. The room erupted in chaos. Richard was on his phone, presumably calling his legal contacts. Eleanor was crying into her napkin. Kate had taken both children into the living room, away from the unfolding disaster. The police? Victoria's voice was barely audible now. They'll be arriving at your apartment in about 10 minutes, I finished for her. Anonymous tip about medical fraud. They're very interested in those documents you're so eager to share about your time with Gregory. The line went dead. I turned to my husband of 15 years, the father of my children, the man I'd thought I knew. Happy Thanksgiving, Gregory. I believe the police will be stopping by here next. You might want to change out of that cashmere sweater before they take you in for questioning. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a scene from a crime drama. Blue and red lights flashed through our bay windows, casting eerie shadows across our abandoned Thanksgiving dinner. 2 police cars and an unmarked vehicle pulled up silently, their presence drawing curious looks from our neighbors who were probably expecting the usual holiday family drama, not a full-scale police intervention. Mom? Sophie's voice quavered from the living room doorway. There are police cars outside. I crossed to her, pulling her close. She smelled of the vanilla lotion she'd borrowed from my dresser that morning, a lifetime ago, when our biggest concern had been whether the turkey would be too dry. I know, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay. I looked over her head at James, who stood rigid by the fireplace, his jaw set in a way that reminded me painfully of his father. Both of you, go upstairs with Aunt Kate for a while. No, James said firmly. I want to see this. The doorbell rang before I could argue. Maria reached it first, opening the door to reveal 2 detectives and a woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as Agent Chen from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit. Gregory hadn't moved from his seat at the table, his hands flat against the mahogany surface as if trying to anchor himself to the last normal moment of his life. Richard stood behind him, no longer a father but a judge, his face grave as he watched the law enforcement officers enter his son's home. Dr. Gregory Mitchell? Agent Chen approached the table, her badge glinting under our dining room chandelier. We need to ask you some questions about certain irregularities in your clinical trials. He won't be saying anything without legal representation, Richard interjected, his voice clipped. Dad? Gregory finally spoke. I don't think... For once... In your life, listen to me, Richard snapped. These are serious allegations. Federal charges. Eleanor let out a small sob, quickly stifled by her monogrammed napkin. I watched my mother-in-law's carefully maintained world crumbling and felt a surprising surge of pity. She'd raised her son to be better than this. Mrs. Mitchell, Agent Chen turned to me. We'll need to ask you some questions as well. Of course. I gestured to my husband's study. We can speak there. Maria, would you... I'll stay with the kids, my sister nodded, already moving to gather James and Sophie close. The study felt different now, knowing what I knew. How many times had Gregory sat at that massive oak desk, making calls to Victoria while I slept upstairs? How many documents had he falsified on that laptop, pushing through trials without proper protocols because the pharmaceutical company was paying him too well to care about ethics? Agent Chen settled into one of the leather chairs while I perched on the edge of the desk. Through the study's open door, I could hear the other officers reading Gregory his rights in our dining room. You've been gathering evidence for some time, Agent Chen stated, consulting her notebook. 2 months, I confirmed. Since I discovered irregularities in our joint accounts. Large deposits that didn't match hospital salary payments. And you didn't confront your husband? No. I smiled thinly. I did what any good researcher would do. I dug deeper. I opened the bottom drawer of Gregory's desk, removing a second manila envelope, this one thicker than the one I'd shown earlier. Your office should have received an anonymous tip with copies of these documents, but here are the originals. Bank statements, emails between Gregory and Victoria's pharmaceutical company, internal memos about rushing trials through approval. Agent Chen leafed through the papers, her eyebrows rising slightly. This is comprehensive. I had help, I admitted. Linda, Gregory's secretary, had been keeping her own records. She felt guilty about the patients who'd been pushed into trials without full disclosure of the risks. And Janet from the hospital board, she'd suspected something for months, but couldn't prove it. Until you started asking questions. Amazing how many people want to talk when someone finally listens. I stood, moving to the window. In the street below, more unmarked cars had arrived. Victoria was careless. She kept everything: emails, hotel receipts, records of payments. She thought they were insurance, proof of their relationship. She never realized she was documenting the fraud. A commotion from the dining room drew our attention. Gregory's voice, raised for the first time I could remember. Diana, what have you done? Agent Chen moved to the door, but I waved her back. He's not going to do anything. Gregory's never handled confrontation well. It's why he had Victoria make the call tonight. He couldn't face telling me himself. As if summoned by her name, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Victoria. They're here, at my apartment. How could you do this to us? I showed the message to Agent Chen. Your team arrived? She nodded. Ms. Peterson is being taken into custody as we speak. The pharmaceutical company is already cooperating, trying to minimize their exposure. Another text from Victoria. I'm pregnant. You can't do this. The pregnancy, Agent Chen glanced at her notes. Is it real? Yes. I moved back to the desk, opening another drawer. And thoroughly documented in the company's health insurance files. They've been covering her prenatal care, against policy, since she wasn't supposed to be involved with a doctor overseeing their trials. More evidence of the ethics breaches. Through the study windows, I watched a police car pull away. From our curb, presumably heading to Victoria's apartment. Our neighbors had given up pretending not to watch, gathering in small clusters on their pristine lawns. By morning, the story would be all over our exclusive suburb. The respected neurosurgeon, his pregnant mistress, the medical fraud scandal. Mrs. Mitchell, Agent Chen's voice softened slightly. This couldn't have been easy. Investigating your own husband, gathering evidence while maintaining normalcy at home. Actually, I turned back to her, it was surprisingly simple. Gregory never thought I'd look too closely at his work. He'd convinced himself and Victoria that I was just the supportive wife, the perfect hostess, too naive to question anything. A knock at the study door revealed one of the detectives. We're ready to transport Dr. Mitchell for questioning. Judge Mitchell has called their family lawyer. I nodded, gathering my composure. I should check on my children. Of course. Agent Chen collected the documents I'd provided. We'll need you to come in tomorrow to make a formal statement. In the dining room, Gregory stood flanked by officers, his hands secured behind his back. The cashmere sweater looked absurd now, a costume from a life that had ended the moment Victoria's call came through. Diana, he pleaded, we can talk about this. Whatever they're paying you. Paying me? I cut him off, incredulous. You think I did this for money? Then why? His voice cracked. Everything I did, all the trials, the research, it was for us, for our future. No. I stepped closer, close enough to smell his expensive cologne. It was for you. And for her. The houses you were looking at together, the private school funds you'd set up for the baby, all paid for with money from pushing untested drugs on desperate patients. Eleanor gasped. This was apparently news to her. Richard's face had turned to stone. How did you... Gregory trailed off, realization dawning. The realtor. Sandra told you about the house viewings. Sandra felt terrible about lying to me. Apparently, Victoria wasn't very nice to her. I straightened Gregory's collar. One last wifely gesture. You should have been more careful about who you trusted. But then, you never were good at judging character. The officers began moving toward the door. Our perfect Thanksgiving dinner sat abandoned on the table, food grown cold, wine glasses half empty. Through the hall, I could hear Sophie crying upstairs, Maria's gentle voice trying to comfort her. What about the children? Gregory asked, desperation creeping into his voice. What about our family? You should have thought about that before you started falsifying drug trials, I replied calmly. Or before you got your mistress pregnant. Take your pick. As they led him out, I noticed his phone on the table where he'd dropped it earlier. One last text from Victoria glowed on the screen. They're taking me in. Do something. But Gregory couldn't do anything anymore. His carefully constructed world of lies, personal and professional, was collapsing around him. By morning, the hospital would distance itself. His colleagues would deny knowledge of his actions, and Victoria's pharmaceutical company would throw them both under the bus to save their corporate reputation. I picked up his phone, sending one final message to Victoria. He can't help you now, and neither can I. Then I turned it off and handed it to Agent Chen. You'll want to add this to your evidence. I'm sure there's plenty more incriminating correspondence. As the last police car pulled away, our front yard finally cleared of official vehicles and curious neighbors. I stood in the foyer of my beautiful home, The home Gregory and I had built together. The home he'd planned to move his pregnant mistress into, and felt nothing but a profound exhaustion. Diana? Maria appeared at my side, her arm sliding around my waist. The kids are asking for you. I nodded, taking one last look at our ruined Thanksgiving tableau. Help me clear the table? No point letting good china sit out all night. Diana? Maria's voice cracked slightly. Stop. Just stop for a moment. You don't have to be strong right now. But I did. Because upstairs, my children were trying to understand why their father had been led away in handcuffs. Because somewhere across town, Victoria was learning that her dream of moving into my house, taking over my life, was ending in a jail cell. Because tomorrow, the story would break, and we'd all need to be ready for the fallout. I'll be strong. Later, I promised, squeezing her hand. Right now, I need to take care of my family. What's left of it, anyway. The night passed in a blur of quiet conversations and muffled sobs. Kate and David insisted on staying, helping Maria clean up the ruins of our Thanksgiving dinner, while I sat with the children in Sophie's room. James hadn't spoken since the police left, but his presence on the window seat, knees drawn up to his chest, was a silent sentinel of support. Sophie alternated between tears and questions I couldn't fully answer. "Where will Daddy sleep tonight?" she asked, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, a gift from Gregory last Christmas. Another lie, I realized now. He'd been with Victoria. That Christmas morning, claiming an emergency surgery. The police need to ask him some questions, I explained, stroking her hair. It might take a while. Because he hurt people? James's voice was rough with emotion. With the medicine stuff? I met my son's eyes, seeing understanding beyond his 14 years. Yes, he made some very bad choices at work, and he hurt people who trusted him. Like, he hurt you? Sophie's question pierced my heart. That's different, sweetheart. But was it? Trust betrayed was trust betrayed, whether in medicine or marriage. Around midnight, Richard and Eleanor finally left for their hotel, unable to stay in the house where their son's life had imploded. Eleanor hugged me fiercely, whispering, "We had no idea about any of it." "I know," I assured her, though part of me wondered how they'd missed the signs. The expensive gifts, the sudden interest in private school endowments, the subtle changes in their son's behavior. After everyone left, I found myself in Gregory's study, surrounded by the remnants of his carefully constructed facade. Medical journals lined the shelves, their spines bearing titles that once impressed dinner guests, but now seemed like props in an elaborate play. On his desk, family photos smiled up at me. Moments frozen in time when we'd been happy, or when I'd thought we were happy. My phone buzzed continuously with texts and calls from friends who'd seen the police cars, who'd heard rumors, who couldn't wait until morning to satisfy their curiosity. I turned it off. Tomorrow would come soon enough, with its demands for explanations and its harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. Around 2 a.m., Maria found me there, still sitting in Gregory's leather chair, staring at nothing. "The kids are finally asleep," she said, perching on the desk. Kate gave Sophie one of her anxiety pills, half a dose. James is in his room, pretending to play video games, but probably just processing. I nodded, too tired to form words. "Diana," Maria leaned forward. "What you did? Gathering all that evidence, staying quiet for months while you built the case. How did you do it?" A bitter laugh escaped me. "Would you believe it started with a coffee cup?" "What?" 3 months ago, I was sorting laundry and found a coffee. Receipt in Gregory's coat pocket, from a place in New York, dated on a day he was supposedly at a conference in Chicago. I traced the edge of his desk calendar. Such a small thing. But it made me look closer. At everything. Maria waited, letting me tell the story at my own pace. Once I started looking, the inconsistencies were everywhere. Conference dates that didn't match his credit card charges, phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. And the hospital finances? I shook my head. Linda, his secretary, she'd been keeping a separate set of books. She knew something was wrong with the trial protocols, but she was afraid to come forward. Until you gave her a chance. Until I gave her proof that she wasn't crazy, that someone else saw it too. I stood, moving to the window. The street was quiet now, no more police cars or curious neighbors. The affair, that almost seemed secondary once I discovered the fraud. He wasn't just betraying me. He was betraying his oath as a doctor. Maria's hand found mine. Why didn't you tell me? I could have helped. I needed to be sure, to have everything documented, organized, the way Mom taught us with her case files, remember? Our mother had been a paralegal, famous for her meticulous organization of evidence. She'd died 5 years ago, but her lessons had stayed with me. The hospital board is meeting tomorrow morning, I continued. They'll want statements from everyone involved. Linda's already agreed to testify about the falsified trial data. Janet has records of every irregular payment, every breach of protocol. And Victoria? My hand tightened on the window frame. Victoria thought she was documenting their love story. Every hotel receipt, every gift, every secret meeting, she kept it all. Proof of their relationship. But all she really did was create a timeline of the fraud. When they met, when the irregular payments started, when the trial protocols began to change. She really thought she was going to move in here? Maria's voice held disbelief. Into my house. With my husband. While carrying the baby they conceived during a medical conference where Gregory was pushing through approval for an untested drug. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. A soft knock at the study door revealed Kate, still dressed in her Thanksgiving outfit but looking considerably more rumpled. Sophie's asking for you, she said softly. I think she had a nightmare. I moved toward the door, but Kate caught my arm. Diana, there are reporters outside the hospital. It's all ready. Starting, of course it was. Boston's top neurosurgeon arrested on Thanksgiving. His pregnant mistress in custody. Millions in fraudulent drug trials exposed. It was the kind of story that would dominate headlines for weeks. The children, I said, suddenly panicked. School. Already. Handled, Maria assured me. I called Headmaster Phillips. James and Sophie have been excused for the next week, with arrangements for remote learning if needed. I sank back into Gregory's chair, overwhelmed by the practical details of our unraveling life. The hospital will suspend his privileges. The mortgage, our accounts, are already separated, Maria finished. Remember, you did that last month when you first took the evidence to the FBI. The house is in your name. Your accounts are protected. She was right. I had prepared for this, methodically and thoroughly. But somehow the reality of it felt different from the planning. Upstairs, Sophie's cry pierced the late-night silence. I rose automatically, mother's instinct overriding everything else. Diana? Kate called after me. What are you going to tell? Them? About their father? I paused at the study door. The truth, that their father made terrible choices, that he hurt people who trusted him, that sometimes the people we love aren't who we thought they were. And about the baby? Maria's question was gentle but unavoidable. The baby, Gregory and Victoria's child, who would be born in a prison hospital while both parents faced federal charges. My children's half-sibling, conceived in betrayal and corruption. One truth at a time, I said finally. Right now they need to understand that none of this is their fault, that what Gregory and Victoria did, all of it, was about their own selfishness, not about our family. As I climbed the stairs to Sophie's room, my phone buzzed one final time before dying. A text from an unknown number, probably Victoria. using her one phone call to make one last attempt at what? Threats? Pleading? Explanations? It didn't matter anymore. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Reporters, lawyers, hospital board meetings, curious neighbors, judgmental school parents. But tonight, my children needed their mother. Not the woman who had meticulously gathered evidence for months. Not the wife who had exposed her husband's crimes. But just their mom. I pushed open Sophie's door, where my daughter's tear-stained face turned toward me in the soft glow of her nightlight. "Mom?" "I'm here, sweetheart," I said, settling onto her bed. "I'm right here." And I was. Stronger than Gregory had ever suspected, more resilient than Victoria had calculated, and ready to protect what really mattered. Not the perfect facade we'd maintained for so long, but the truth that would set us all free. Dawn broke over Boston with merciless clarity, bringing with it the first wave of media coverage. I sat in the kitchen, clutching a cup of untouched coffee, watching the early morning news transform my private nightmare into public spectacle. Breaking news in the medical community, the anchor's voice filled our silent kitchen. Prominent neurosurgeon Dr. Gregory Mitchell of Massachusetts General Hospital has been arrested on charges of medical fraud and ethics violations. Sources say Dr. Mitchell, along with pharmaceutical representative Victoria Peterson, is accused of falsifying clinical trial data. Maria muted the TV before they could show Gregory's official hospital photo, or, worse, a shot of our house with police cars in the driveway. "You don't need to watch this," she said, sliding into the chair beside me. "Yes, I do." I unmuted the television. "We need to know what they're saying, what the children might hear." The story was expanding by the minute. Gregory's arrest, Victoria's involvement, the scope of the fraudulent trials. Each new detail sparked fresh waves of texts and calls from people I'd thought were friends, their concern barely masking their hunger for gossip. Dr. Mitchell's wife, Diana Pierce Mitchell, was instrumental in uncovering the fraud, the reporter continued. Sources say Mrs. Mitchell gathered evidence over several months. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Janet from the hospital board. "Diana? The emergency meeting starts in an hour. Will you be there?" I glanced at the kitchen. Clock, 7:15 a.m. Has it really been only 12 hours since Victoria's call disrupted our Thanksgiving dinner? "I'll be there," I assured her. "Have the pharmaceutical company representatives arrived?" "Their entire legal team landed an hour ago." Janet's voice dropped. "They're trying to distance themselves from Victoria, claiming she acted without authorization. But your evidence shows they knew exactly what was happening," I finished. "The payment records prove it." After ending the call, I forced myself to eat a piece of toast, knowing I'd need strength for the day ahead. Kate appeared in the doorway, already dressed for battle in one of her court suits. My sister-in-law never went anywhere unprepared. "The children are still sleeping," she reported. "David's staying with them while we're at the hospital. And—" "Diana?" Gregory's lawyer called. "They want to talk." Of course they did. Gregory would be desperate to minimize the damage, to find some way to salvage his reputation, but it was too late for that. "Any word from Victoria?" Maria asked, scrolling through news updates on her tablet. Her lawyer advised her to stay quiet. I stood, moving to rinse my coffee cup. But the evidence speaks for itself. Every trial she helped push through, every payment she facilitated, it's all documented. Upstairs, a door creaked open. James's footsteps, then Sophie's lighter ones. My children facing their first morning in a world where their father was a criminal? "Mom?" James appeared in the kitchen, still in his pajamas but with eyes that had aged years overnight. "It's all over the internet. My friends are texting." I crossed to him, pulling him close despite his teenage resistance to hugs. "I know, honey. We'll deal with it together." Sophie trailed in behind him, her face puffy from crying. Everyone will know? Yes, I said honestly. But remember what we talked about last night? None of this is your fault. Your father and Victoria made their choices. Bad choices. But that has nothing to do with who you are. Maria squeezed Sophie's shoulder. And anyone who says different will have to deal with your aunts. The hospital board meeting was scheduled for 8:30 a.m. I dressed carefully, choosing a charcoal gray suit that projected competence and control. The woman in my mirror looked composed, professional. Nothing like the wife whose world had shattered over Thanksgiving dinner. The press is gathered at the main entrance, Kate reported, checking her phone as we pulled into the hospital parking garage. But Janet arranged for us to use the staff entrance. Security met us at the door, not the usual retirees who checked IDs, but serious men in dark suits who'd clearly been hired for crisis management. They escorted us through back corridors to the administrative wing, where Janet waited outside. The boardroom. They're all here, she whispered. Hospital administration, pharmaceutical reps, ethics committee members. The FBI sent agents, and the state medical board representatives just arrived. I nodded, gripping my briefcase containing copies of everything I'd gathered over the past months. Linda? Inside. She's nervous, but ready to testify about the falsified records. The boardroom fell silent as we entered. Faces I'd seen at countless hospital fundraisers now regarded me with a mix of sympathy and calculation. The pharmaceutical company's legal team occupied one corner, their expensive suits and careful expressions screaming damage control. Dr. Harrison, the chief of medicine, opened the meeting with practiced gravity. We're here to address serious allegations regarding clinical trials conducted under Dr. Gregory Mitchell's supervision. For the next 2 hours, I listened as my evidence was presented, explained, analyzed. Linda's hands shook as she described how Gregory had pressured her to alter trial data, to hide adverse reactions, to push through approvals without proper protocols. And these payments? The FBI agent held up bank statements. Regular deposits. 2 offshore accounts tied to trial approvals. Dr. Mitchell said they were consulting fees. Linda's voice was barely audible. But they always came right after he approved moving trials to the next phase, even when patients were showing complications. The pharmaceutical representatives shifted uncomfortably as their own internal emails were displayed, messages showing they knew about the rushed trials, the hidden side effects, the kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. Mrs. Mitchell, Dr. Harrison turned to me. When did you first suspect something was wrong? I met his gaze steadily. When patients started dying. The room went still. 3 patients in the experimental drug trial for glioblastoma, I continued. Their deaths were recorded as disease progression, but the timing, they all experienced similar complications that had been documented in early trials, but somehow never made it into the final protocols. Janet handed out copies of patient records, heavily redacted, but showing clear patterns of adverse effects that had been systematically downplayed or hidden. And Ms. Peterson's role in this? The state medical board representative leaned forward. Victoria ensured the trial data looked clean before it went to the approval committees. She coordinated the payments, arranged meetings where Gregory could present selective data to key decision-makers. I opened my briefcase, withdrawing more documents. Every hotel receipt, every dinner reservation, every private meeting. She kept records of all of it. Probably thought she was documenting their romance. Instead, she was creating a paper trail of criminal conspiracy. The pharmaceutical company's lead lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Mitchell, these are serious allegations. They're not allegations. I cut him off. They're facts, documented, dated, and verified. Your company knew exactly what Gregory and Victoria were doing. You encouraged it, profited from it, and now you're trying to pretend they acted alone? I handed the FBI agent a final file. Here are internal memos from your company's compliance department, flagging concerns about the trial protocols. Concerns that were ignored because the potential profits were too tempting. The meeting continued, but the outcome was already clear. Gregory's medical license would be suspended pending investigation. The pharmaceutical company would face its own probe. And Victoria would learn that keeping souvenirs of her affair had created the perfect evidence trail of criminal conspiracy. The press is waiting for statements, Janet murmured as the meeting ended. The hospital's PR team has prepared. No, I stood, gathering my things. No statements. The evidence speaks for itself. As we left through the staff entrance, I caught a glimpse of television crews clustered at the main doors. They'd have to content themselves with official hospital statements and no comments from administrators. I had more important things to deal with. Diana, Maria touched my arm as we reached the car. Victoria's lawyer called while you were in there. She wants to make a deal. I laughed, a short, harsh sound. Of course she does. Now that she's facing federal charges instead of moving into my house, she wants to negotiate. She's still pregnant, Kate reminded me gently. The baby. Gregory's child who would enter the world surrounded by scandal and shame. My children's half-sibling, innocent of their parents' crimes but forever marked by them. One thing at a time, I said, sliding into the car. Right now, I need to get home to James and Sophie. They're the only children I can help right now. But, as we drove away from the hospital, where Gregory had built his reputation on lies and corruption, where Victoria had plotted to take over my life, I couldn't help wondering about that unborn child. Would they grow up knowing the truth about their parents? Would they understand that sometimes exposing lies is the only way to honor truth? My phone buzzed with a text from David. Kids are asking when you'll be home. Sophie's teacher called. Offered to arrange counseling, home, to my children, who needed their mother to be strong. To our house, where memories of 15 years of marriage competed with evidence of Gregory's betrayal. To a life forever changed by one Thanksgiving dinner phone call that had shattered our perfect facade and exposed the rot beneath. We'll need to make statements eventually, Kate said as we turned onto our street. The media won't stop asking. Let them ask, I replied, watching our house come into view. The truth is in the evidence. Every document, every record, every piece of proof. That shows exactly who Gregory and Victoria really are. They wrote their own story. I just made sure everyone could read it. The following week unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare. Each morning brought fresh headlines, new revelations, and an ever-expanding circle of people caught in Gregory and Victoria's web of deceit. Second pharmaceutical company linked to Mitchell fraud case, Maria read from her tablet over breakfast. Federal investigators examining connections to multiple drug trials. I was spreading peanut butter on Sophie's toast, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while our world crumbled publicly. James hadn't gone to school all week, instead attending classes virtually from his room. His teachers had been understanding, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. Mom? Sophie pushed her breakfast around her plate. Lily texted me. She wants to know if I'm coming to her birthday party next weekend. My heart clenched. Lily was her best friend, but her mother was on the hospital board. Would she still want Sophie around, now that Gregory's crimes were public knowledge? Do you want to go? I asked carefully. Sophie shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes. Maybe not. The doorbell rang. Another reporter trying to get a statement, probably. We'd disconnected our landline after the first day of constant calls, but determined journalists still found ways to reach us. Maria checked the security camera we'd installed. It's Linda. Gregory's secretary stood on our porch, clutching her purse like a shield. She looked smaller somehow, without her usual professional armor. I hope it's okay that I came, she said when I opened the door. I needed to tell you something about Victoria. I led her to the kitchen where Maria was already pouring coffee. The children had disappeared upstairs, a new habit they'd developed whenever visitors arrived with more bad news about their father. She's talking, Linda said, warming her hands around the coffee mug. To the prosecutors. telling them everything about the trials, the payments, the covered-up complications. Trying to save herself, Maria muttered. Yes, but... Linda glanced around, as if expecting Gregory to materialize in his own kitchen. There's more. She's claiming she has evidence about other doctors, other trials. The implications hit me like a physical blow. How far did this corruption spread? How many other patients had been put at risk? My phone buzzed. Janet again. Diana? The FBI is expanding their investigation. They're looking at every trial Gregory supervised in the past 5 years. Every doctor he worked with, every pharmaceutical rep who came through his department. Closed my eyes, remembering hospital fundraisers where Gregory had introduced me to his colleagues. How many of them had been involved? How many had known? There's something else, Linda said quietly. About the baby. Maria's hand found mine under the table. Victoria's lawyer is using the pregnancy to negotiate a lighter sentence, claiming she was manipulated by Gregory, that he promised to leave you, to build a new life. Linda trailed off. But, I prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. But the dates don't match. According to the medical records I found, Victoria was already pregnant when the biggest trial went through, the one where they hid the severe complications. She knew what she was doing. She was fully involved. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made us all look up. James stood in the doorway, his face a mask of teenage pain. Is it true? He demanded. What they're saying online? About Dad killing people? Linda paled. Maria started to rise, but I held up a hand. My son deserved the truth. Your father approved. Drugs for trials without proper testing, I explained carefully. He hid information about dangerous side effects, and yes, some patients died because they didn't have all the facts when they agreed to the treatments. James absorbed this, his jaw working. And Victoria, she helped him? She helped arrange it, made sure the dangerous information didn't reach the right people, got him paid for doing it. While she was pregnant, he said flatly. With their... Yes. He turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. A door slammed, above us. Linda set her coffee cup down with trembling hands. I should go. The FBI wants me to review more files this afternoon. After she left, Maria and I sat in silence, listening to the sounds of our broken family. Sophie's music playing faintly from her room, James's muffled pacing overhead. Diana, Maria finally spoke. What are you going to do about the baby? The question had been haunting me since Thanksgiving night. Gregory and Victoria's child, my children's half-sibling, would be born while both parents were facing federal charges. Victoria's lawyer called again, I admitted. They want me to speak to the judge before sentencing. Talk about her cooperation with the investigation. Are you going to? Before I could answer, my phone rang. Eleanor Mitchell. Diana? We need to talk about the baby. Of course. Gregory's parents would want to be involved with their grandchild, even one conceived in such circumstances. Have you spoken to Victoria's lawyer? Eleanor's voice was strained. Not yet. She's claiming Gregory coerced her, that she was afraid to say no to the fraud because he threatened to end their relationship, to deny the baby. That's not true, I cut her off. I have proof. Emails, texts, recordings. Victoria was an equal participant. She helped plan everything, coordinate the payments, hide the evidence. But the baby... Eleanor's voice cracked. Our grandchild. The doorbell rang again. This time, the security camera showed Kate, carrying what looked like legal documents. I have to go, I told Eleanor. We'll figure something out about the baby. Kate swept in, laying papers across our kitchen table. Gregory's lawyer sent over divorce papers. They're hoping to move quickly before the criminal trial starts. I stared at the documents, 15 years of marriage reduced to legal terminology, and asset divisions. They've included provisions about the baby, Kate continued carefully, trying to protect Gregory's parental rights, ensuring inheritance options. While he's in prison? Maria's voice dripped sarcasm. How paternal of him. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Victoria's lawyer. My client wishes to discuss arrangements for the child. She understands her legal situation and wants to ensure the baby's future is secure. The baby's future. What future could there be born to parents facing federal charges? What would that child be told about their origins, about the crimes that surrounded their conception? Mrs. Mitchell? We all turned. Sophie stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas despite the late morning hour. Amy's mom is outside, she said, quietly. She wants to talk to you. Amy was another of Sophie's friends, daughter of a patient who'd been in one of Gregory's trials. My stomach clenched. But when I opened the door, Amy's mother wasn't angry. She was crying. Thank you, she said, grabbing my hands. Thank you for exposing the truth. Amy, the headaches she was having during the trial, they told us they were normal, that we shouldn't worry. But they weren't normal, were they? They were hiding the complications. I led her inside, away from potential media eyes. No, they weren't normal. They were documented side effects that Gregory and Victoria kept out of the trial protocols. Amy could have died, she whispered. If we hadn't pulled her out when we did, more families would be coming forward, I realized. More parents are learning how close their children had come to disaster. More patients discovered that their trust had been betrayed not just by Gregory, but by an entire system that prioritized profit over safety. My phone buzzed yet again. Janet, with more news from the hospital board. They've suspended 3 more doctors, she reported. Found connections to Gregory's trials, evidence they knew about the hidden complications. The pharmaceutical companies are in full panic mode, trying to contain the damage. The damage. To reputations, to careers, to the hospital's standing. But what about the damage to patients? To families who'd trusted their doctors to tell them the truth? Diana? Maria touched my arm. The prosecutor's office is on the other line. They want to schedule your formal testimony. I looked around my kitchen, at the divorce papers spread across the table, at Amy's mother still crying softly, at Sophie hovering uncertainly in the doorway, at the pieces of a life shattered by lies and betrayal. Tell them I'm ready, I said. It's time everyone heard the whole truth. The truth about Gregory's corruption, about Victoria's calculated manipulation, about a system that allowed them to gamble with patients' lives for profit. And somewhere in a jail cell, Victoria's unborn child grew, innocent of their parents. Crimes but destined to be born into their consequences. My phone buzzed one final time, a message from an unknown number, probably Victoria using another lawyer's phone. Please, for the baby's sake, help me. I deleted it without responding. I had my own children to protect, my own truth to tell. The baby would have to wait. The criminal trial began on a cold December morning, 3 weeks after that fateful Thanksgiving dinner. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, their breath visible in the winter air as they jostled for position, hoping to catch a glimpse of Boston's most notorious medical scandal. I sat in the witness preparation room reviewing my testimony one last time. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, paced before me, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Remember, she said, stick to the facts. The documentation of the trials, the payment records, the communication between Gregory and Victoria. Don't let their lawyers bait you into emotional responses, as if I could be more emotional than I already was. Outside this room, my children sat with Maria and Kate, waiting to watch their mother testify against their father. James had insisted on coming, despite my reservations. I need to hear it all, he'd said that morning. No more secrets. Mrs. Mitchell? A court officer appeared at the door. They're ready. The main courtroom was packed. I spotted hospital board members, pharmaceutical executives, medical ethics committee representatives, all waiting to witness the unraveling of Gregory's carefully constructed empire of lies. Gregory sat at the defense table, wearing a suit that looked slightly too large. Jail food clearly didn't match his usual dietary preferences. His lawyer, Martin Walsh, projected confident detachment, but I could see tension in his shoulders. Victoria sat at a separate table with her own legal team. Her pregnancy was more visible now, the slight swell of her abdomen visible even under her conservative navy dress. She didn't look at me as I passed. Please state your name for the record, the court clerk intoned. Diana Pierce Mitchell? And your relationship to the defendants? A loaded question if ever there was one. I am Gregory, Mitchell's wife. Or I was, until the divorce papers were finalized yesterday. A murmur ran through the courtroom. We'd pushed the divorce through quickly, my lawyers arguing successfully for an expedited process given the circumstances. Mrs. Mitchell, the prosecutor, began, please tell the court when you first became aware of irregularities in Dr. Mitchell's medical trials. I took a deep breath, remembering Sarah's advice. Stick to the facts. 3 months ago, I found discrepancies in our financial records, large deposits that didn't match hospital salary payments. That led me to investigate further, and I discovered communications between Gregory and Victoria Peterson regarding clinical trial protocols. What kind of communications? Emails, texts, and recorded conversations discussing how to modify trial data, how to hide adverse reactions, how to fast-track approvals without proper safety protocols. Walsh objected, claiming hearsay, but was overruled when Sarah produced the certified copies of all communications. And the payments? Sarah prompted. Regular deposits to offshore accounts, coordinated by Victoria through her pharmaceutical connections. Each payment coincided with trial approvals or protocol modifications. For the next 2 hours, I laid out the evidence I'd gathered. Every document, every recording, every piece of proof showing how Gregory and Victoria had systematically compromised patient safety for profit. The prosecution enters into Evidence Exhibit 47, Sarah announced, displaying emails on the courtroom screens. Communications between Dr. Mitchell and Ms. Peterson discussing the concealment of severe complications in the glioblastoma trial. I heard gasps from the gallery as the emails appeared. Gregory's clinical discussion of hiding patient deaths, Victoria's suggestions for reclassifying adverse reactions as disease progression. They knew, I said, my voice steady. They knew patients were dying from complications, but they kept pushing the trials forward. The payments were too good to stop. Victoria's lawyer stood for cross-examination, his expensive suit a sharp contrast to his client's prison-approved attire. Mrs. Mitchell, isn't it possible you've misinterpreted these communications? Perhaps seeing conspiracy where there was only normal professional interaction? Normal professional interaction doesn't require offshore accounts, I replied. Or falsified death certificates. He changed tactics. You discovered your husband's affair with my client. Isn't it possible your investigation was motivated by revenge? Sarah started to object, but I was ready for this. I discovered the medical fraud first, I said clearly. The affair came later. But you're right. Finding out Gregory was sleeping with someone who helped him hide patient deaths did clarify things. It showed exactly what kind of people they both are. Victoria flinched. Gregory stared at the table. And now that my client is pregnant, her lawyer continued, carrying your children's half-sibling, don't you feel any obligation to— Objection. Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. Relevance. Sustained, the judge agreed. The witness's feelings about the defendant's pregnancy are not at issue. But the question hung in the air. What about the baby? What about this innocent child who would be born into this mess of corruption and betrayal? The cross-examination continued, both legal teams trying to either strengthen or discredit my testimony. Through it all, I kept my focus on the evidence, on the facts that couldn't be disputed or explained away. During a brief recess, I found James and Sophie in the hallway. My son's face was stoic, but I could see the pain in his eyes. "You okay?" I asked softly. He nodded. Did Dad really know people were dying?" "Yes," I said, because I'd promised them no more lies. "He knew." Sophie leaned against me. "What happens now?" "Now we tell the truth," I said. "All of it. No matter how much it hurts." Back in the courtroom, Linda took the stand, describing years of being pressured to alter records, to look the other way, to stay quiet about her concerns. "Dr. Mitchell said it was for the greater good," she testified. "Getting these drugs approved quickly would help more patients in the long run. But people were dying." Janet testified about the hospital board's growing suspicions, about red flags that had been ignored because Gregory's department brought in too much money to question. Through it all, I watched Gregory and Victoria, these two people who had planned to destroy my life, who had gambled with patients' lives for profit, who had created a child in the midst of their corruption. Victoria's lawyer made one last attempt during closing arguments. My client was manipulated by a powerful, respected doctor. She's expecting his child, facing an uncertain future. But the evidence spoke louder than any emotional appeals. The jury took less than 6 hours to reach their verdict. On the charge of conspiracy to commit medical fraud, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of accepting illegal kickbacks? Guilty. On the charge of falsifying medical records resulting in patient death? Guilty. Count after count, the verdicts came in. Gregory's carefully constructed world of privilege and power crumbled with each guilty. Victoria's dreams of taking over. My life ended not in my house, but in a prison cell. As the deputies led them away, Victoria turned to me. "Diana, please. The baby." But I was already walking away, gathering my children close, leading them out of the courtroom where their father's crimes had been laid bare. Outside, the winter sun was setting early, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Reporters called questions, cameras flashed, but we moved steadily through them toward where Maria waited with the car. "Mom?" Sophie's voice was small. "What happens to the baby when it's born?" The question I'd been avoiding since Thanksgiving. Gregory and Victoria's child, an innocent caught between justice and revenge, between truth and consequences. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever happens, it's not your responsibility, not your burden to carry." My phone buzzed. Eleanor. Mitchell, probably wanting to discuss grandparent rights, to plan for the baby's arrival. But I couldn't think about that yet. Right now, my children need me. Right now, the truth had been told, justice had been served, and we had to find our way forward in this new reality. The reporters followed us to the car, still shouting questions. "Mrs. Mitchell, what about the baby? Will you seek custody? No. You know about the affair when you started investigating?" But none of that mattered now. What mattered was my children, their healing, our future. The baby. The baby would have to wait. As we drove away from the courthouse, leaving Gregory and Victoria to face the consequences of their actions, I thought about how a single phone call on Thanksgiving had changed everything. How one moment of arrogant triumph, Victoria thinking she could claim my life, had led to the exposure of years of corruption. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways. Sometimes the truth emerges from the strangest circumstances. And sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people's own actions reveal exactly who they are. The weeks following the trial brought a different kind of chaos. While Gregory and Victoria awaited sentencing in separate detention facilities, the ripple effects of their crimes continued to spread through Boston's medical community. I sat in my home office, reviewing emails from Janet about the expanding investigation. 3 more doctors had been implicated in Gregory's fraudulent trials. 2 pharmaceutical companies were facing congressional inquiries. The hospital's reputation was in tatters. "Diana?" Maria knocked softly, entering with fresh coffee. "The hospital board sent over more documents. They want you to review the patient files from the Davidson trial." The Davidson trial, one of Gregory's earliest experiments with falsifying data. How many lives had been affected? How many families were just now learning the truth about their loved ones' treatments? "Mrs. Mitchell?" I looked up to find Linda hovering in the doorway, clutching a thick manila envelope. She'd taken to bringing me information directly, too nervous to trust hospital channels. "More records?" I asked, gesturing for her to sit. "From the archived files. Cases from 5 years ago that match the pattern. Rushed approvals, hidden complications, unexpected deaths." She paused, twisting her hands. "And something else. About Victoria." I set down my coffee. "What about her?" She did this before. At her previous hospital in Chicago. I found records of similar trials, similar patterns of concealed data. She left suddenly, right before an internal audit. Of course she had. Victoria's manipulation of Gregory hadn't been her first attempt at this scheme. She'd perfected it elsewhere, learned how to exploit doctors' egos and ambitions. My phone buzzed. A text from Kate. "Gregory's lawyer reached out. He wants to make a deal before sentencing." Another buzz. Janet. 2 more pharmaceutical. Reps have come forward. They say Victoria approached them about similar arrangements with other doctors. The scope of the corruption was staggering. How many patients had been affected? How many lives had been risked for profit? "Mom?" James stood in the office doorway, his school backpack slung over one shoulder. He'd finally returned to in-person classes, facing the whispers and stares with remarkable strength. "There's a woman outside. She says she needs to talk to you about Dad's trials." Through the front window, I could see a middle-aged woman pacing on our porch, clutching what looked like medical files. "Patricia Wilson," Linda said quietly, recognizing her. "Her husband was in the glioblastoma trial. He didn't make it." I nodded to Maria. "Show her in. She deserves answers." Patricia Wilson's hands shook as she spread her husband's medical records across my desk. "They said the treatment was safe," she whispered. "Dr. Mitchell said the early trials showed promise, minimal side effects." "But there were side effects," I finished gently. "Severe ones. They just hid them from the approval committees." "Tom trusted him. We both did." Her voice cracked. "The headaches, the seizures. They said it was disease progression. Normal for glioblastoma patients. But it wasn't, was it?" "No," I confirmed, pulling out the real trial data from my files. These symptoms were documented in early trials. Gregory and Victoria knew the risks, but the pharmaceutical company was paying too well to stop. Patricia stared at the documents, at the evidence of how her husband's death had been classified, hidden, used to push through more trials. "The police," she said finally. "The prosecutors. They want me to testify at the sentencing hearing. Tell the judge what happened to Tom." "You don't have to," I assured her. "The evidence is clear enough." "Yes, I do." She straightened, grief hardening into resolve. "People need to know what they did, all of it." After she left, I found James still hovering nearby, having heard everything. "How many?" he asked. "How many people did Dad—" "We don't know yet," I admitted. "The investigation is still ongoing. But each day brings more cases, more families like Mrs. Wilson." My phone buzzed again, Eleanor Mitchell calling for the 3rd time today. I let it go to voicemail, knowing she wanted to discuss Victoria's pregnancy, the baby's future, and the family's legacy. The baby. Victoria was 7 months along now, her due date approaching while she sat in a detention center, awaiting sentencing. The child would be born into this mess of corruption and consequences, carrying the weight of their parents' crimes. Diana? Kate appeared, legal documents in hand. Gregory's lawyer sent over the updated plea agreement. He's willing to testify about other doctors involved and provide evidence about the pharmaceutical company's knowledge. In exchange for what? Reduced sentence. And… She hesitated. He wants visitation rights. With the baby. Of course he did. Even now, Gregory was trying to negotiate, to minimize consequences, to maintain some control over the situation. What about Victoria? Maria asked. Is she still claiming she was manipulated? No, Linda answered, surprising us all. She's talking. About everything. Other hospitals, other doctors she approached. It's like once the truth started, coming out she couldn't stop. My phone buzzed yet again. Janet with more news from the hospital board. Third pharmaceutical company implicated. Stock prices are falling. Board members resigning. The dominoes were still falling, each revelation leading to more exposure, more consequences. Gregory and Victoria's corruption had infected the entire system, and now everyone was scrambling to contain the damage. Mom? Sophie appeared, her school uniform still pristine despite the late hour. My daughter had become almost compulsive about appearances lately, as if perfect clothes could somehow shield her from the chaos. Grandma Eleanor keeps texting about the baby. The baby. Always the baby. This unborn child who had become the center of everyone's concern, the focus of negotiations and legal maneuvering. What do you think? I asked Sophie gently. About having a half-sibling? She twisted her charm bracelet, a nervous habit she'd developed since Thanksgiving. Will they be like Dad? Like Victoria? No, sweetheart. They'll be their own person, innocent of everything their parents did. But they'll know, won't they? About what happened? About the people Dad hurt? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a new message, this time from Victoria's lawyer. Client requesting meeting. I want to discuss the baby's future. Willing to provide more evidence in exchange for your involvement. Always negotiating. Always trying to manipulate situations to their advantage. Even now, facing years in prison, Victoria was still playing angles, still trying to use her pregnancy as leverage. Diana, Maria said softly, you'll have to decide eventually. About the baby. About your role in their life. She was right. This child would be James and Sophie's sibling, Eleanor and Richard's grandchild, a permanent connection to the people who had betrayed us all. Through the window, I watched another news van cruise slowly past our house. The story wouldn't die. Boston's respected neurosurgeon, his pregnant mistress, the elaborate fraud scheme exposed by his own wife. Every day brought new revelations, new victims, new consequences. But somewhere in a detention center, a baby grew, unaware of the chaos they would be born into. Unaware that their first breaths would be drawn in a prison medical unit, their first days spent in the shadow of their parents' crimes. My phone buzzed again, a different message this time, from the prosecutor's office. Sentencing hearing. Scheduled. Both defendants need your victim impact statement. Victim impact. How could I possibly capture the impact of what Gregory and Victoria had done? To our family, to their patients, to the entire medical community. Mom? James's voice pulled me back to the present. What are you going to say? At the sentencing? I looked at my son, seeing the weight of knowledge in his young face. The truth, I said simply. About everything they did. Every life they risked. Every trust they betrayed. And the baby? The baby. Always the baby. One truth at a time, I told him. First, we make sure justice is served. Then we figure out how to move forward. But as I turned back to the mounting evidence on my desk, to the stories of lives destroyed by Gregory and Victoria's greed, I wondered if moving forward was even possible. How do you build a future on the ruins of such devastating betrayal? The answer, I supposed, would come one day at a time. One truth at a time. One consequence at a time. Just like it had started, with a single phone call on Thanksgiving night. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a gray January morning. Snow fell softly outside the courthouse, covering Boston in a deceptive blanket of peace. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. I sat in the front row of the courtroom, flanked by Maria and Kate. James had insisted on coming again, but Sophie had chosen to stay home with David. "I can't watch anymore," she'd said that morning, her young face too serious. "I can't keep seeing Dad like that." The gallery was packed with victims' families, hospital staff, and media representatives. Patricia Wilson sat directly behind me, one of many who would give impact statements today. Linda huddled near the back, still uncomfortable being too close to Gregory despite her crucial testimony. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Henderson entered. Gregory was led in first, shackled and wearing prison orange, a far cry from his custom-made suits and carefully cultivated image. 8 weeks in detention had left him looking older, grayer, his confident surgeon's posture replaced by a defeated slump. Victoria followed, her pregnancy now impossible to hide. 8 months along, she kept one hand protectively over her belly as she was guided to her seat. Her lawyer had tried to use her condition to argue for house arrest, but the prosecution had successfully argued that her role in patient deaths made her a flight risk. "Before the court proceeds with sentencing," Judge Henderson began, "we will hear victim impact statements. Ms. Wilson?" Patricia rose shakily, clutching a photograph of her late husband. For the next 20 minutes, she described Tom's final days, the pain Gregory had dismissed, the complications Victoria had helped hide, the trust they had placed in their doctor's words. "He told us the headaches were normal," she said, her voice breaking, "that the seizures were just the tumor, but they weren't. They were killing him, and they knew. They knew, and they let it happen." More families followed. Parents of children. In the pediatric trials. Spouses of patients who had died believing they were helping advance medical science. Each story added another layer to the mountain of betrayal Gregory and Victoria had built. Finally, it was my turn. I approached the podium, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Gregory stared at the table, but Victoria watched me, one hand still cradling her swollen belly. "Your Honor," I began, "I could talk about how Gregory and Victoria betrayed my trust, destroyed my family, tried to steal my life. But that's not why I'm here today." I pulled out the files I'd been gathering since Thanksgiving. Patient records, trial data, death certificates with causes falsified to hide the truth. I'm here because of them. I held up a photo of Tom Wilson. And them. Another photo. A young girl from the pediatric trial, now permanently disabled by hidden complications. And every other patient who trusted their doctor to tell them the truth. My voice stayed steady as I detailed the evidence. The pattern of deception, the calculated risks taken with human lives, the profits earned through suffering. Gregory wasn't just my husband. He was a doctor who took an oath to do no harm. Victoria wasn't just his mistress. She was a pharmaceutical representative who knew exactly what they were hiding. Together, they created a system where profit mattered more than patients, where success was measured in kickbacks rather than lives saved. I turned to face them directly. They're asking for leniency because of the baby, because this child shouldn't have to be born in prison. But they didn't show leniency to their patients. They didn't think about the children left without parents, the families destroyed by their greed. Victoria flinched. Gregory's lawyer started to object, but Judge Henderson waved him down. "This isn't about revenge," I continued. "It's about justice. For every patient who suffered, every family who grieved, every person who trusted them with their lives and got lies in return." I returned to my seat, feeling James's hand slip into mine. My son, forced to grow up too fast, learning the hardest lessons about truth and consequences. Judge Henderson reviewed her notes, her expression grave. The court has considered the evidence presented during trial, the victim impact statements, and the recommendations from both prosecution and defense. She turned to Gregory first. Dr. Mitchell, you violated the most sacred trust between doctor and patient. You used your position to enrich yourself at the expense of those who relied on your judgment and expertise. Gregory seemed to shrink further, into himself, as she continued. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison. You will surrender your medical license and pay restitution to the victims' families. You will have no contact with any current or former patients or their families. Then she turned to Victoria. Ms. Peterson, your role in this conspiracy was equally calculated. You facilitated the fraud, coordinated the cover-up, and helped hide evidence of patient deaths. Victoria's hand tightened on her belly as the judge continued. The court sentences you to 20 years in federal prison. After the birth of your child, you will begin serving your sentence immediately. You will be barred from any future employment in the pharmaceutical or healthcare industries. The sentence is announced. Judge Henderson addressed one final matter, the one everyone had been dancing around. Regarding the minor child, she began, the court recognizes this situation presents unique challenges. Once born, the child will be placed in temporary custody while permanent arrangements are determined. Both defendants' parental rights will be severely restricted during their incarceration. I felt James stiffen beside me. This was his sibling being discussed so clinically, a baby who would enter the world surrounded by legal proceedings and prison protocols. As the court adjourned, the reality of the sentences settled over the room. Gregory and Victoria had gambled everything: ethics, lives, their own freedom, and lost it all. Victoria's lawyer approached me as we prepared to leave. My client wants to speak with you about the baby. There's nothing to discuss, I started, but he persisted. She's due in 3 weeks. The prison medical facility. He glanced around before continuing quietly. It's not equipped for complications. She's scared. For the first time, I looked at Victoria. Really looked at her. Beyond the designer maternity dress, beyond the carefully styled hair, I saw fear in her eyes. Not for herself, but for the child she was carrying. My phone buzzed. Eleanor Mitchell again. I knew what she wanted. The same thing Victoria's lawyer was asking. The same thing everyone seemed to expect. Mom! James's voice was soft. What are we going to do? About the baby? That was the question, wasn't it? What were we going to do about this innocent child born of betrayal but blameless in their parents' crimes? As we left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. Mrs. Mitchell, will you seek custody? What about the grandparents' rights? Do your children want to know their siblings? But I had no answers. Not yet. First, we had to process today. The sentences, the justice served, the consequences finally delivered. The baby. The baby would come soon enough. And with them, a whole new set of decisions, challenges, and truths to face. For now, I held my son close as we walked through the falling snow, leaving Gregory and Victoria to face the justice they'd earned, one calculated betrayal at a time. Victoria went into labor on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into her detention at the minimum security facility where she was being held until sentencing. I received the call while helping Sophie with her science project, a cruel irony not lost on me that we were studying the ethics of medical testing. Mrs. Mitchell? The prison administrator's voice was carefully neutral. Ms. Peterson has been transferred to Massachusetts General's secure ward. Given the circumstances, we thought you should be notified. The same hospital where Gregory had conducted his fraudulent trials. The same halls where he and Victoria had plotted their deceptions. Now she would deliver their child there, under guard, while he sat in a federal detention center across town. Mom? Sophie looked up from her project, seeing something in my expression. Is the baby coming? I nodded, watching my daughter process this new reality. Yes, Victoria's at the hospital. Should we? She hesitated, twisting a strand of hair nervously. Should we go? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. Again, Eleanor Mitchell. Diana? We're on our way to the hospital. Richard's trying to get permission to have Gregory transferred, to be there for the birth, but… No, I cut her off firmly. He lost that right when he chose to risk patients' lives for profit. A heavy silence followed. Then, will you come? The baby. It's still James and Sophie's sibling. I looked at my daughter, seeing the confusion and curiosity warring on her young face. I'll think about it. Maria arrived within the hour, having heard the news through her network of hospital contacts. The secure ward is on lockdown, she reported. 2 guards posted. Victoria's lawyer is trying to argue for privacy, but given the flight risk… How… is she? The question surprised even me. Scared. Young. Finally facing something she can't manipulate her way out of. Maria studied me carefully. Janet called. Some of the victims' families are gathering outside the hospital. They heard about the birth. Of course they had. This baby had become a symbol of betrayal, of consequences, of innocence born from corruption. My phone buzzed continuously. Kate offering legal advice about potential custody issues, Linda sharing, updates from hospital staff, Janet warning about media presence. Everyone wanting to know what I would do about this child who connected us all to Gregory and Victoria's crimes. Mom? James stood in the doorway, car keys in hand. We should go. Not for them, for the baby. My son, showing more wisdom than his father ever had. The hospital parking lot was a circus of news vans and protesters. Signs demanded justice for trial victims, mixed with others calling for compassion for the newborn. Police kept a careful perimeter around the entrance. We were escorted through a back entrance, passing through multiple security checkpoints. The secure ward felt surreal. Medical equipment mixed with prison protocols, nurses working alongside, corrections officers. Victoria's labor had been progressing for hours. Through the window of her room, I could see her pacing, one hand on her back, the other clasped by her mother, who shot me a venomous look when she noticed us. Mrs. Mitchell. Victoria's lawyer materialized at my elbow. Thank you for coming. Given the circumstances, we hope to discuss… Not now, I cut him off. This isn't about legal maneuvers or custody arrangements. This is about a child being born. He persisted. But after the birth, decisions will need to be made. Temporary guardianship while Victoria serves her sentence. I said not now. A nurse hurried past, entering Victoria's room. From inside, we heard the increasing tempo of monitors, the urgent voices of medical staff. Complications, Maria whispered, her gallery owner's eye for detail catching everything. The baby's heart rate. I found myself moving before I could think, pushing through the door into Victoria's room. She looked up, surprise and fear mixing on her face. Diana? Her voice was strained with pain. What are you… Shut up, I said quietly. This isn't about you or Gregory or anything you did. This is about making sure this baby arrives safely. Her mother started to protest, but Victoria grabbed my hand as another contraction hit. In that moment, we weren't victims and perpetrators, weren't betrayed and betrayer. We were just 2 women focused on bringing a new life into the world. The next hours passed in a blur of medical terms and monitoring equipment. James and Sophie waited outside with Maria, while I stayed, watching Victoria face the one thing she couldn't control or manipulate. At 3:47 a.m., amid the beeping of monitors and the controlled chaos of the medical team, a baby girl entered the world. 6 pounds, 4 ounces of innocent life, untouched by her parents' crimes. She's beautiful, Victoria whispered, tears streaming down her face as the baby was placed briefly on her chest before being whisked away for standard tests. "She looks like Gregory," I finished. She did. The same dark hair, the same determined chin. Let's hope that's where the resemblance ends. Victoria's face crumpled. "Diana, don't." I stepped back from the bed. "Don't try to apologize or explain or manipulate this moment. You're going to prison, Victoria. For a very long time. This baby deserves better than false promises and practiced lies." The baby was returned, swaddled in standard hospital blankets. A guard stood by the door, a reminder that this wasn't a normal birth celebration. "Have you chosen a name?" the nurse asked tentatively. Victoria looked at me, then at her mother, then back at the tiny bundle in her arms. "Grace," she said finally. "Her name is Grace. Grace." A word that meant mercy, forgiveness, divine favor. None of which Victoria or Gregory deserved, but perhaps exactly what this child would need. My phone buzzed. Eleanor and Richard had arrived, eager to meet their newest grandchild. The victims' families were still outside, their vigil a reminder of lives lost to Gregory and Victoria's greed. Somewhere in his cell, Gregory was probably receiving news of his daughter's birth. "Mom?" "James." And Sophie appeared in the doorway, uncertain but curious. Can we see her?" I nodded, watching my children approach their new sister. Sophie reached out tentatively, touching Grace's tiny hand. James stood back, his face a mix of emotions I couldn't quite read. "She's so small," Sophie whispered. "She doesn't know about anything." "No," I agreed. "And she doesn't need to. Not yet." Victoria's lawyer hovered nearby, clearly bursting to discuss custody arrangements and visitation rights. Eleanor and Richard waited outside, ready to stake their claim as grandparents. The media would be crafting headlines about the fraud baby, born in custody, but for this moment, we all just watched Grace sleep, innocent of the chaos surrounding her birth, unaware of the choices and consequences that had brought us all to this point. My phone buzzed again. A message from Gregory's lawyer. "Client requesting photos. Willing to discuss additional evidence about pharmaceutical company involvement in exchange." I deleted it without reading further. Always negotiating, always trying to trade information for advantage. Some things never changed. "Diana?" Victoria's voice was weak, heavy with approaching sleep. What happens now?" I looked at this woman who had tried to steal my life, who had helped my husband risk patients' lives for profit, who had given birth while facing decades in prison. Then I looked at Grace, perfect and innocent in her hospital bassinet. "Now," I said quietly, "we make sure she has a better life than the one you and Gregory planned. A life built on truth, not lies." As if understanding, Grace opened her eyes, Gregory's eyes in a newer, innocent face. The future, born from betrayal but offering a chance at redemption. Not for her parents. Their path was set, their consequences earned. But for this child, this innocent, there could be a different way forward. The sun was rising over Boston, casting long shadows through the hospital windows. A new day, bringing with it new challenges, new decisions, new truths to face. And in her bassinet, Grace slept on, unaware that her first breath had changed all our lives once again. The weeks following Grace's birth unfolded in a complex tapestry of legal battles, family negotiations, and media scrutiny. While Victoria recovered in detention and Gregory remained isolated in federal custody, their newborn daughter became the center of a storm that threatened to rival the original scandal. I sat in my lawyer's office on a cold February morning, watching snow fall outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown high-rise. Sarah Matthews's desk disappeared under mountains of custody paperwork, competing claims, and court evaluations. The leather chair beneath me felt too soft, too comfortable for the weight of decisions we faced. The custody situation is unprecedented, Sarah explained, adjusting her reading glasses as she sorted through another stack of documents. Both parents are facing lengthy federal sentences for medical fraud. Multiple family members filing competing claims. The media attention alone creates significant complications. My phone buzzed, Linda forwarding more revelations from the hospital investigation. 3 more doctors implicated in Gregory's trial schemes. Board members resigning. Federal investigators are expanding their probe into other departments. The Mitchells filed updated paperwork this morning, Sarah continued, pulling out a fresh document. They're citing their resources, family connection, and ability to provide Grace with a life removed from the scandal. Their lawyers are pushing hard. Of course they are, I muttered, remembering Eleanor's tearful phone call the night before. She'd alternated between pleading and subtle manipulation, a skill Gregory must have learned from somewhere. Another. Buzz, Janet this time, pharmaceutical company stocks in freefall. CEO resigned. 3 more executives under investigation. Gregory's testimony opening floodgates. Even from prison, my ex-husband's actions continued to ripple outward, touching more lives, exposing more corruption. And somewhere in the hospital's NICU, a 2-week-old baby slept peacefully, unaware of the chaos surrounding her existence. Mrs. Mitchell? Sarah's assistant appeared at the door. Dr. Chen is here, and Victoria's parents just arrived. The conference room felt too small for the tension it contained. Victoria's mother, Margaret Peterson, sat rigidly in her chair, her husband Thomas beside her. Their middle-class appearance and obvious exhaustion contrasted sharply with the Mitchells' polished prosperity, but their determination was equally fierce. Grace belongs with her maternal grandparents, Margaret stated firmly, her hands clenched around a worn leather purse. We're younger than the Mitchells. We can provide a stable home. On a retired teacher's pension? Eleanor Mitchell cut in smoothly. In a 3-bedroom house in Worcester? Grace deserves— What Grace deserves, Dr. Rachel Chen interrupted, is to be raised somewhere she'll be protected from exactly this kind of conflict. The court-appointed guardian ad litem commanded attention without raising her voice. 20 years of experience. Navigating complex family situations showed in her calm demeanor and precise language. I've reviewed all the custody claims, she continued, opening her portfolio. The Mitchells offer financial security but seem unable to acknowledge the full scope of their son's crimes. Mrs. Peterson, while your devotion to your grandchild is admirable, your continued insistence that Victoria was merely Gregory's victim concerns me. My phone lit up with a message from the NICU nurse. Grace is gaining weight steadily. Strong appetite. She holds on to fingers now. Quite a grip. I smiled despite myself, remembering how Sophie had been the same way as a newborn. The thought of my daughter sent a fresh wave of complexity through an already complicated situation. There's also the matter of Grace's siblings, Dr. Chen continued, as if reading my mind. James and Sophie's relationship with their half-sister will be crucial to her development. How they process this connection, how they handle the public attention, which is exactly why she should be with us, Eleanor interjected. Away from constant reminders of the scandal, somewhere she can have a fresh start. A fresh start built on denial? The words left my mouth before I could stop them. Like you denied the changes in Gregory? The signs that something was wrong? Eleanor flinched. Richard Mitchell straightened in his chair, legal training kicking in. Now, see here. No, you see here, I continued, surprising myself with the calm in my voice. Grace doesn't need a fresh start. She needs the truth. About who her parents are, about what they did, about everything. She deserves that much. My phone buzzed again. Gregory's lawyer trying another angle. Client willing to sign over full parental rights in exchange for consideration at sentencing. Eager to discuss terms. I deleted it without reading further. Even now, he was trying. To negotiate, to trade pieces of his children's lives for personal advantage. Diana is right, Dr. Chen said into the tense silence, which is why I'm recommending something different entirely. All eyes turned to her. I'm recommending that custody of Grace Mitchell be awarded to Diana Pierce Mitchell, with structured visitation rights for both sets of grandparents. The room erupted. Margaret Peterson's "absolutely not" collided with Eleanor Mitchell's "you can't be serious." Thomas Peterson began listing reasons why his family should have priority, while Richard Mitchell cited legal precedents about grandparents' rights. Through it all, Dr. Chen remained calm. Mrs. Mitchell has demonstrated remarkable strength and judgment throughout this situation. She exposed the fraud while protecting her own children. She handled the media attention with grace. Most importantly, she understands exactly who and what Grace's parents are, without either denying their crimes or using them as weapons. She's the reason our daughter is in prison, Margaret protested. No, I corrected quietly. Victoria's actions put her in prison, her choices, her decisions to help hide patient deaths for profit. My phone lit up with another message. James. This time. Mom? The social worker said we might be able to visit Grace today. I want her to know she has a family who'll tell her the truth. The truth. It had started this whole journey. One hidden receipt leading to exposed fraud. One phone call revealing years of betrayal. Now the truth could guide us forward, helping us build something new from the ashes of what Gregory and Victoria destroyed. If I take custody, I said slowly, there need to be clear boundaries. No negotiations with Gregory or Victoria. No trading visitation for legal considerations. No using Grace as a bargaining chip in their games. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. Sarah began making notes. Supervised visitation for grandparents, I continued. Structured, documented, with clear guidelines about what can and cannot be discussed. With Grace. She'll know the truth when she's old enough. Not rumors or sanitized versions, but the real story. About her parents, about the lives they risked, about everything. You can't possibly think this is appropriate, Eleanor protested. Having her raised by what? I challenged. By the woman her father betrayed? By the person who exposed their crimes? Or by someone who will make sure she grows up understanding that truth matters more than appearances, that right and wrong aren't negotiable? Margaret Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. We just want what's best for her. So do I said more gently. Which is why she needs to be with her siblings, with people who won't hide the truth from her. She deserves the chance to build her own identity, separate from her parents' crimes but not ignorant of them. My phone buzzed one final time, a photo from the NICU nurse. Grace slept peacefully, tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. So innocent, so unaware of the storm surrounding her existence. Dr. Chen began outlining her official recommendations. Sarah drafted preliminary custody agreements. The grandparents' lawyers started negotiating visitation schedules. Through it all, I kept looking at that photo, at this tiny life born from betrayal, but offering a chance at something better. Sometimes, I realized, the best revenge isn't exposure or justice or even truth. Sometimes, it's simply choosing love over bitterness, choosing to build rather than destroy. Even if what you're building comes from the very thing meant to break you, and somewhere in the NICU, Grace slept on, unaware that her future was being shaped by the very truth that had exposed her parents' lies, unaware that she had a family ready to love her, protect her, show her a better way than the one Gregory and Victoria chose. One truth at a time, one day at a time, one choice at a time. That's how we would build something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. 1 year later, I stood in Grace's nursery, watching the early morning sunlight filter through lavender curtains. She slept peacefully in her crib, dark hair, so like Gregory's, curling slightly at her temples, tiny fingers clutching her favorite stuffed elephant. At 13 months, she was already showing a personality distinctly her own. Stubborn, curious, and surprisingly gentle. Mom! James appeared in the doorway, his school uniform perfectly pressed. At 15, he'd grown taller than me, his face losing its boyish roundness. The reporters are outside again. Anniversary coverage. Of course they were. 1 year since Gregory and Victoria's sentencing, since the medical fraud scandal had blown open the entire pharmaceutical industry, since a baby born in custody had come home to the very family her parents had tried to destroy. Phone buzzed. Janet, still keeping me updated on the aftermath. 5th pharmaceutical company under federal investigation. 3 more hospitals reviewing all trial protocols. Gregory's testimony opened floodgates that won't close. Should I take the back way to school? James asked, adjusting his backpack. No, I said firmly. We don't hide, not anymore. Grace stirred. Her eyes, Gregory's eyes in a more innocent face, blinking open. She smiled when she saw me, reaching up with complete trust. Sometimes that trust still took my breath away. Diana? Maria's voice floated up from downstairs. Eleanor and Richard are here. Monthly visitation. The custodial arrangement had taken months to perfect. Structured visits with both sets of grandparents, carefully monitored interactions, clear boundaries about what could be discussed. The Mitchells had finally accepted my terms, though Eleanor still occasionally tested limits. Good morning, precious. Girl! I lifted Grace from her crib, breathing in her baby scent. Ready to see Grandma and Grandpa Mitchell? Baba, she responded, her current favorite word for everything. Downstairs, Eleanor and Richard waited in the living room. They'd aged this past year, the weight of their son's crimes and imprisonment showing in new lines on their faces, but they'd also grown, slowly learning to accept the truth rather than hide from it. She's getting so big, Eleanor breathed, reaching for her granddaughter. Richard, look at how she's walking now. Diana. Richard nodded formally. A year of monthly visits hadn't completely thawed our relationship, but we'd reached an understanding. The trust paperwork is finalized. Grace's educational fund is secured, completely separate from Gregory's assets. My phone buzzed. Linda this time. Hospital board implementing new trial protocols. Complete overhaul of approval process. Your exposure to the fraud changed everything. Change. It seemed to be the only constant these days. Mom. Sophie appeared, 13 now and starting to show hints of the young woman she'd become. I finished the essay about everything for my therapy journal. She'd been seeing Dr. Anderson for 8 months, working through her feelings about her father's crimes, her new sister, and the changed shape of our family. The journal had been her therapist's suggestion, a place to tell her truth without fear or judgment. Can I read it? I asked, settling Grace in Eleanor's arms. Sophie nodded, handing me carefully written pages. Her neat handwriting filled 3 sheets, telling our story through her eyes. The Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything. The discovery of her father's crimes. The baby sister was born from betrayal, but loved without reservation. It's for the school magazine, she explained quietly. Dr. Anderson thinks it might help other kids whose parents, who have complicated families. Complicated, such. A simple word for such a complex reality. My phone lit up with another message. Victoria's lawyer. Client requesting updated photos. Willing to provide additional testimony about pharmaceutical company involvement in exchange. I deleted it without responding. Even in prison, Victoria was still trying to negotiate, to trade pieces of her daughter's life for personal advantage. Grace deserved better than that. Diana? Eleanor's voice pulled me back to the present. There's something we need to discuss, about Gregory. I tensed, but her next word surprised me. He's asked us to stop sending him photos of Grace. Says he needs to accept that he's lost the right to be her father. Progress. Finally, the victims' families are organizing a support network, Richard added, bouncing Grace on his knee. For people affected by fraudulent trials, they want to work with the hospital, help implement new safety protocols. My phone buzzed. Again, Janet sharing the latest statistics. 27 doctors under investigation. 5 pharmaceutical companies facing federal charges. Hundreds of trial protocols being reviewed. The ripples of truth continued to spread. Mom. James lingered in the doorway, reluctant to leave for school. Do you think Grace will understand, when she's older, about everything? I looked at my children, James with his questioning eyes, Sophie with her carefully written truth, Grace with her innocent trust, each carrying pieces of this story, each finding their own way forward. She'll understand because we'll tell her the truth, I said simply. Not just about Gregory and Victoria, but about how love can survive betrayal. About how family isn't just blood or circumstance, but choice. Like you chose her, Sophie said softly. Even after everything they did. I chose all of you, I corrected. Every day I choose this family. This is the truth. This way forward. Grace squirmed out of Eleanor's lap, taking wobbly steps towards Sophie. My daughters. One born from love turned to betrayal. One born from betrayal transformed by love. James moved to spot his baby sister, protective instincts overriding teenage reserve. My phone buzzed one last time, Maria sharing a news alert. Major pharmaceutical company CEO indicted. Gregory Mitchell's testimony, key to investigation. Medical fraud scandal continues to expose industry-wide corruption. The truth, once started, couldn't be contained. Time for school, I reminded James and Sophie. Grandma and Grandpa Mitchell will watch Grace until Maria arrives. Diana, Eleanor called as I gathered my things for work. The museum had promoted me to head curator, impressed by my investigative skills rather than scandalized by my connection to Gregory. Thank you for letting us be part of her life, for helping us face the truth about Gregory. The truth. It had started with one hidden receipt, one phone call, one moment of arrogant triumph when Victoria thought she could claim my life. Now it has transformed into something larger, exposing corruption, protecting patients, reshaping an entire industry. But more importantly, it has transformed us, all of us. I watched James help Sophie with her backpack, saw Eleanor and Richard entertaining Grace with practiced ease, and felt Maria's steady presence as she arrived to take over childcare duties. This patchwork family, built from the ashes, of betrayal but stronger for its scars. Mom? Sophie paused at the door. I love you. For everything. For showing us that sometimes the worst things can lead to the best things. Grace echoed her sister's sentiment in her own way. Baba. And I knew, in that moment, that we'd done more than just survive Gregory and Victoria's betrayal. We'd alchemized it into something precious. Truth strong enough to protect future patients. Love strong enough to transcend biology. Family strong enough to weather any storm. Sometimes the best revenge isn't exposure or justice or even truth. Sometimes it's simply living well, loving deeply, and letting your choices rather than your circumstances define you. As I watched my children head out to face the waiting reporters, heads held high, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. One receipt, one phone call, one truth leading to another, and in my arms, Grace. Living proof that beauty can grow from ashes, that love can transcend betrayal, that family is more about choice than blood. Ready for another day? I asked my youngest daughter. She smiled. Gregory's eyes in a face untroubled by his crimes, Victoria's determination turned toward joy rather than manipulation. Baba, she agreed solemnly. And we stepped forward together into a future built on truth, strengthened by love, and made beautiful by the very betrayal meant to destroy us. Some stories end with justice, some end with revenge. But the best stories, I've learned, end with love, chosen daily, given freely, stronger than any betrayal. That's the truth that saved us all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.